Thank you all for being here. This is, I don't know, it's about the 8th time we've done a climate lab at the New York Historical Society, and I swear it's been this identical weather for each one. Thank you all for coming out in this. My name is Russell Shorto. I am the director of the New Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical Society, and we do programming related to New York's Dutch beginnings, so the history, but also themes that come out of that, one of which is the Dutch, as you know, were the pioneers in water management and water and climate and resilience and parks, and all of those things are very relevant today. Thank you all very much for being here. I want to acknowledge Louise Muir, our fearless leader at New York Historical Society, is here, and Valerie Paley. Oh, please go ahead. Yes, give her a round of applause. And Valerie Paley, who's the head of the library and the Center for Women's History. And we have an excellent program and an exciting one, dramatic by virtue of the fact that our council member is not yet here. So we're waiting for him, and he'll make, I think, a dramatic entrance. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a moment, but first, Paul Gottsagen, who's the board chair of New Yorkers for Parks, has a couple of remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. First, a warm welcome to all here on this rainy night. And for those watching, thank you very much. Thank you for your attendance. So, as you know, I assume you know, this marks the official release of New Yorkers for Parks' 1% for Parks Impact Report. While this important discussion begins soon, a few thank yous are in order. Thank you to Dr. Helen Mirror and the New York Historical Society Board of Trustees, Mr. Russell Shorto, who will lead tonight's discussion with Councilman Krishnan and Daniel Abram, and, well, not, he's going to be replaced, but we'll talk about him in a minute. The Board of New Yorkers for Parks, of course, for their steadfast support, both financially and with their collective wisdom. Adam Ganzer, Executive Director. The project team at HR&A and the Charles Revson Foundation, which made this report possible. Also, to Ms. Betsy Smith, who is here tonight and who has stood and stands by us, not just representing the Central Park Conservancy, of which she is president and CEO, but also for her deep and personal support and commitment these past few years. So thank you. Also here is Liz Goldstein from MAS. Thank you, Liz. And lastly, a special shout out to Laura Washington, who I don't think is here, but Laura Washington and the New York Historical Society's Climate Labs, whose magical efforts made the live streaming possible. So that's it. A little housekeeping things. Please, on your way out, please visit our table on the way out. We have a lot of great materials. And also importantly is that on March 22nd at 9 a.m. at City Hall Park, we have a rally, which we, you know, New Yorkers for Parks is a rally, so we'd love you to attend for that as well. And that's it, and I'm going to turn this back to Russell. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So we're going to have a little conversation here, and as Paul said, Adam is going to sit in briefly, or I hope briefly, not for Shekar when he gets here. Then we'll give him a little introduction as well. So as you heard, Adam Ganzer is the Executive Director of New Yorkers for Parks. Next to me, Daniel Abram is Project Manager of Research and Policy at New Yorkers for Parks, the city's leading parks advocacy organization. Daniel contributed research and policy recommendations for New Yorkers for Parks' 5-point plan for park equity, as well as the 1% for Parks Impact Report, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking history in the sense of recent history since the 60s and 70s, but since it is the New York Historical Society, I thought I would give a little bit of historical perspective, as it seems to me that the city's parks begin in the year 1686 with Governor Thomas Dongan and the Dongan Charter, in which the city charter officially put all waste, vacant, unpatented, and unappropriated lands under the Common Council, the forerunner of the City Council. The first parks that came out of that were Bowling Green Park, the Battery, and the Vlakte, I get to get a Dutch word in there, or the Flats, which became City Hall Park. Fast forward to recent times. Daniel, this report is about 1% of the parks budget. That's what you're advocating for. Talk about that number. Why is it important?
So it's 1% of the city's expense budget being allocated to the Parks Department. Currently, the Parks Department stands at 0.6%.
Can you hold it a little closer?
Sorry, yes. Yeah, so currently the parks budget stands at 0.6%, and we are advocating for 1%, which would get us to a good state of good repair in the Parks Department, which essentially means maintenance issues in the parks would be addressed on a regular day-to-day basis rather than currently a week-to-week basis.
Breaking news, our council member has arrived. Thank you, Adam, for your willingness to sit in.
You did a better job than me.
Okay, so a dramatic entrance, a less dramatic introduction. Shekar Krishnan is the New York City Council Member for District 25, which includes Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, Queens, two of the most diverse immigrant communities in the world. As the chair of the Council's Committee on Parks and Recreation, he negotiated the highest budget ever for New York City parks, which he champions as key components of social, racial, and immigrant justice. Welcome, Shekar.
Thank you so much for having me, Russell. Good to be on the panel with you too, Daniel. And Adam, you would have done a much better job than me on the panel anyway, so maybe it was the best that you were on first. But it's so nice to see you all. I'm Council Member Shekar Krishnan, and really excited to talk about our parks today. Apologize, I'm a few minutes late. My older son was called home sick from school, and that's probably one of the most challenging things of this job, is to balance out everything we've got, plus 2 working parents at home and 2 kids. But it's nice to be here, and thank you for having me and the Historical Society for this panel as well, and of course, New Yorkers for Parks.
Okay, so I just asked Daniel about the 1% figure. Is there some magic in that 1%? I mean, do cities generally, is that kind of what's special about it?
Yeah, so New York is actually among the lowest in the percentage of allocation to the Parks Department at 0.6%. We have 30,000 acres of land. Minneapolis has 4,000, 5,000 acres of parkland, and they allocate 5.3%. So they're allocating way more than we are. And this is also presumably a city where a lot of people have backyards. So for New Yorkers, for 8 million New Yorkers, parks are our backyard. And to not be allocated at 1% at this point is a bit of a disappointment. But yeah, we're continuing to advocate for it.
Shekar, the Mayor Adams campaigned on 1%. And presumably, my understanding is that 1% is what the city is pushing for, has put in place. So what's the sticking point here? What's problematic right now?
Well, I think, to what Daniel said too, I think it's important to first contextualize this conversation where we are right now. When you look at other major cities, every major city, and the New Yorkers for Parks report makes that clear, LA, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Chicago, how much more they dedicate towards their parks, despite the fact that we have much more park space. And so proportionally, it's so much less that we spend is really shocking. And it goes back, right, not just, I think the report points this out too, it goes back 4 or 5 decades where you see over time, and I've seen the data with our Parks Committee before every hearing, the steady decline in investment of public dollars in our parks, despite the fact that our parks have become more and more essential as spaces for all of us, and of course we've seen that during COVID. And you know, I representing Jackson Heights and Elmhurst in Queens really saw that we were the epicenter in the entire country, and yet have ranked 50 out of 51 council districts when it comes to park space. So against that backdrop, you know, the urgency of this issue couldn't be any greater. And as I've said over and over again, Mayor Adams campaigned on this issue. He specifically stated and signed on to every pledge that he would allocate 1%. So I expect him to keep that promise. We have to hold him accountable to do so, but you know, you're expected to keep your word as when you say you're going to do something. And so I think part of it is really this administration. I think that is a long-term goal of theirs. That's true, but it's, you know, we should have had this yesterday. So at this point, it's really thinking about our values as a city hall and administration, about what they want to prioritize and want to support. And I think all of us in the city council have our vision, and that's certainly what all of us are together advocating for. But to me, it's not a question of resources. It's not a question of, you know, is the money there? It's just a question of the will to actually do it. We're not talking about much really at all.
You mean in terms of the overall budget?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a $100 billion budget for New
So
York.
the math is very easy. We're talking about basically $1 billion.
That's correct. We are talking about but at this point now, we're with the last parks budget about $640 million. You know, we're a bit the preliminary budget proposed by the mayor walks back and retreats on some of the gains that we made. But when you think about it in the context of a much larger budget of $100 billion, what we need to do to get to 1% at a minimum is just a small amount, a fraction of really the huge return on investment that we'd see by putting that money into our park system.
Well, I want to come back to that too. You know, it's these numbers and where the city is right now, and you know, it depends on how you interpret the numbers or which numbers you're looking at. But let's back up a little bit, Daniel. In the 1960s, it was what, 1.4%, something?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
And then in the 70s is when it changed.
Yes.
What happened and why?
So the fiscal crisis hits, and New York's budget gets cut to 0.5%, and it's been at 0.5%, well, up now to 0.6% since then. So since the 80s, it's been at about 0.5% to between 0.5 and 0.6%.
And what does this mean exactly in practical terms? Staffing, for example.
So from a staffing perspective, I mentioned Minneapolis before, Chicago and San Francisco. I have 1 gardener for every 14 acres. New York has 1 gardener for every 118 acres. So, you know, that's a huge disparity. There's no way that the Parks Department could actually manage that space, only having, you know, 1 gardener for so many acres on a week-to-week, let alone a daily basis. So 1% would allow us to add enough gardeners to employ what is called a fixed post maintenance strategy, where park workers would be at the parks, in the parks on a regular basis, daily basis, rather than what they're doing now, which is a mobile strategy, where they are traveling from site to site, dealing with traffic, dealing with time constraints, and moving through that park as fast as they can so that they can meet their schedule. So say, for example, Russell, you're in your favorite park on a Tuesday, and it looks great because the mobile maintenance crew was just there. But let's say you go back on that Thursday, there's no guarantee that the park will not be overflowing with trash, that there won't be a broken bench, that there won't be graffiti, because that team has been out at other parks for the duration of those 2 days when all of those other things have come up. And so now allocating 1% would allow a fixed post staff to be in the park to address problems when they happen, rather than on a kind of a sporadic basis.
And we're talking about parks over a certain size.
Yes. Yes, I believe it's. I actually don't remember parks which size. I think it's over
You got a lot of
30
great
acres.
statistics in here, but yeah, you can kind of get lost in them. And so what are there, 1,500 parks, something like that?
There are
Listen?
1,700 parks.
1,700 parks. Now, just a quick little detour. We've got all those 1,700 parks which are under New York City Parks Department. Then there are the conservancy parks, the Central Park, Battery Park, Prospect Park, which have their own funding, their own.
Right.
And then we've got these friends groups scattered all around the city who do what they can to support their parks.
Right.
So how does that all fit together, and how, is the city oversee all of that?
So the city is in partnership with conservancies and in partnership with Friends of and volunteer groups. But these Friends of and volunteer groups are born of necessity to be able to step in where the Parks Department has not been able to address maintenance issues, to try to add additional programming to their park. But in a lot of cases, and again, you mentioned Battery Park, Central Park, that accounts for like less than 1% of the parks in the city that have any kind of attention from a conservancy or a volunteer group. 99% of parks don't have that, and for that 99%, they're left with a Parks Department that's not entirely whole to be able to maintain these spaces, program these spaces. And what we'd like to see when 1% is allocated, I say when, what we would like to see is these volunteer and friends of groups to be able to be freed up a little bit and be able to do a lot more community outreach and make the park a community center, along with their rec centers as well, to be part of their community and be stronger in their community as well.
And I just wanted to add to that, and I think Daniel's point is so important, right? This is really, and given my perspective, both coming from a neighbor that's such a little park space, and before this, a fair housing lawyer for many years, really thinking about the way the attention and resources our parks get in our green spaces really depends on where you live. And so the point about maintenance, I think is so crucial for our funding and what it could mean for us. I was just on a panel earlier today with the Brooklyn Parks and Open Space Coalition, and just two things stood out to me in our conversations. One was, one of the members of the coalition was talking about her community garden in Canarsie and wanting to find ways to get simply a hose or water access for their community garden, and how difficult it was and immensely difficult to secure resources from the Parks Department to do so. And I think about my own park in Jackson Heights. We have one park, Traverse Park, that for the first time, maybe 4 years ago, we actually got grass in the park itself. We didn't have it before. It was all asphalt, but in the park renovation, we got grass, which was great. But now the new issue is with maintenance. I'm always thinking about in our district, well, how do we allocate the funding to fund a maintenance worker or a staff position to take care of that grass every spring when it's reseeded, when it's trampled upon. And that's the only patch of grass we have in the park. And so, so many parks across the city, when we talk about an equity issue, really depend upon the maintenance budget and the resources of our parks for some of the basic services, whether it's water access, grass maintenance, things like that, are everyday concerns. But without a parks budget that provides adequately for maintenance, these are the everyday concerns I hear from so many across the city who don't otherwise have the resources they need to take care of the very little green space that they have in our communities.
Maintenance is one thing, safety is another for people who are in the parks.
Yeah, allocating 1% would allow the Parks Department to hire more PEP officers. And I want to be clear about who and what PEP officers are. They're not cops. They are people who are in the park to make sure that people know what the rules are, and they do enforce the rules, but there are also just not enough of them. There are a line item for about 400 of them, but there are only 350. They work in pairs, and for a park system that has 1,700 parks, 30,000 acres, it's impossible that they can be everywhere. And so adding PEP officers will address some of the safety concerns that people have expressed and that we've seen from the mayor's preliminary management report, that there's a 29% increase in crimes against people. There's a 27% increase in crimes against property. And that's a product of not having, first, clean and beautiful spaces where people feel like they can't commit crimes. And second, just having a presence, a uniformed presence, whether it's a PEP officer, whether it's a gardener, whether it's a maintenance worker, in some capacity to be able to kind of, again, make the park feel safe.
And the budget also includes things like, not just maintenance, but maintenance includes things like planting trees. Any ideas here, how much does it cost to plant a tree in New York City for the Parks Department? Somebody want to throw out a figure? 1,800, he said. 3,500, right? That's what it says in your report.
Yes.
$3,500 to plant a single tree.
Yes.
And is the Parks Department behind in that? How is this long-term? Well, let me just put this in a different context. The overall benefits, environmental. Talk about environmental in an age of climate change and resilience.
Sure, yeah. The Parks Department manages 2.5 million trees, half of which are street trees. Those trees are important for stormwater diversion, carbon capture. They are important for protecting us against the urban heat island effect with the tree canopies. And if it's so expensive to build trees, you can imagine that a lot of our most vulnerable communities, like Shekar's community, don't have enough trees to protect them from the effects of climate change. And being able to maintain those trees is incredibly important as well, because if there's a fallen limb, or anytime there's a fallen limb that's related to snow or to a storm, the Parks Department is the department that's called to manage that. So it's incredibly important for us as we experience additional storms, stronger storms, increased heat. It's really important for us to maintain these spaces. And parks themselves reduce ambient temperatures by 25 to 45 degrees. And to not invest in this space is, we're setting ourselves up for failure when it comes to climate change.
Shekar, let's get back to the complexities of where we are at the moment in the city and its budget. And I think the mayor's office says that they're on the way to 1%, and there was an increase in staffing of 700 and some positions, but then by some reckonings, another 500 positions were deleted from the Parks Department. So can you sort that out a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the nature of the challenge we're up against. It's, as I said before, we did achieve the largest parks budget in our city's history last year, but that's only a first step. We have a much longer road ahead. But even then, there were regressions. Before even getting to the one that you just mentioned, the first budget had 715 new permanent positions that we created, saving the jobs of many parks workers that were about to expire. But soon after, and so I always, it said this was fundamentally a workers' budget. We were able to protect a number of union workers that were about to lose their jobs. And it's etched in my mind, leading up to that budget negotiation, the number of parks workers who would come up to me at events and otherwise and say, I'm so afraid of losing my job, please make sure to fight for us. And I was very clear, I'm always going to stand by your side, and we'll fight together to make sure to protect your positions. We did, and then maybe a few weeks later, we received notice that, and this made it into the news too, that a number of the parks workers whose jobs we fought for were given termination notices by the Parks Department. And there were larger miscommunications between City Hall, the Parks Department, OMB, and so a number of workers were again about to lose their jobs. And these are our workers taking care of our parks every single day. Many, I remember one in particular who was a single mother taking care of her kids, getting paid an hourly wage and was desperate. And we were able to fight again, and I went back to the Parks Department, back to City Hall, and we were able to protect those positions, but it never should have come to that in the first place, that we were scrambling and I was hearing about it and then I had to scramble again, and DC 37 was a strong force in that too. But it just goes to show you that those gains we can achieve can be walked back. And so now we're facing a similar situation where we achieved all those gains, but the proposals for PEGs has targeted, of course, vacancies in our Parks Department too, jobs that are going away. Positions that we had fought to baseline, there are still workers who aren't covered by all those positions. And so now we're fighting to save those jobs too. Lines called our Playfair lines, which really support our workers who are really the beating heart of our park system, doing the maintenance work every day. And so it's, it's one of those things where you can't kind of just sit still and rest easy, because once those gains are achieved, depending on the climate, they can be rolled back the following year. And that's kind of what we're seeing now and what the fight is ahead of us too.
And go ahead.
I also would have mentioned that what Shekar's mentioning about the, folks getting pink slips is kind of a product of the way that the city has kind of forgotten parks. The parks' overall operating budget has grown 127% since 1980. In that time, the Parks Department has only grown, the budget has only grown 72%. Other agencies, NYPD has...
That's a net loss.
Yeah, a net loss. Other agencies have grown by at least 127%. Major agencies, NYPD 127%, DOE 233%. I think Department of Sanitation is 168%. So these are all critical services, of course, but Parks has not kept up at all with the way that the city's budget has grown, and other agencies that have grown at the same rate, at least the same rate.
And that's what I mean by choices, right? I think that it's not for a lack of resources, but it is historically been that parks have been seen as amenities or luxuries, when we know, and COVID alone showed it, the essential nature of these spaces for our mental health, for our well-being, for so many communities that have needed it, that were so impacted by the public health crisis that we faced. And so, we as a city are making choices where we allow the agencies to grow or invest them to grow significantly, and where we don't. And I think it's a long past time that we recognize and really show with our dollars how important our park spaces are.
Shekar, you talk about this as a fight. Who is on the other side of the fight? Because it seems like everybody is supportive of the idea. So what is it, kind of an invisible opponent?
Well, I think yes and no, right? I think that, it's the most in the immediate term. We as a city council, and I think Speaker Adams in her State of the City, when we talked, for example, about public pools and the fact that there are many districts like mine that don't have access to a public pool, we in the city council, I think, are laser focused on our values and priorities, and that certainly includes much more investments in our parks and our recreation centers and our pools. And so to some level, it is a constant negotiation between the city council, all of our amazing advocates like New Yorkers for Parks, the Playfair Coalition, and City Hall, and an administration, and in that sense. But I think it's also more fundamentally a perspective shift that we're also fighting against too. I mean, it is not, it's when you look at the numbers, the steady decline in parks investments over decades reflects a city that has simply discarded, or at least put to the side, the importance of public support for our parks and government support for our parks. And so that's the mind shift that needs to happen, because I think when that happens, no matter the administration, no matter the politics, right? Because we're talking about spanning multiple administrations at this point. I think when that perspective shift happens, that's when you'll see policies that start to really reflect more of the realities of our parks and green spaces.
And I think that's why this report is so important, because it allows us an opportunity to share with all of you the opportunity to reboot the conversation around funding for maintenance and what that actually means, and really get a sense of what that impact of 1% is for all of us here.
We're talking about environmental benefits and so on, but the most obvious benefit is recreational, people getting out, and this report is full of good statistics. 2.5 million trees, 1,800 basketball courts, 1,000 playgrounds, 800 athletic fields, 65 pools, 14 golf courses.
Yeah, I think 14 beaches too.
The beaches, yeah, that's right. 14 miles of beach.
Yes, there you go.
Gracious.
14 miles of beach, not 14 inches
So,
of beach.
I mean, where are we deficient in that in regard to basic, human benefits?
So as far as public health benefits, just being out in green space has been, for 2 hours a week, has been linked to just better health outcomes. For New Yorkers, the annual healthcare costs could be reduced by $1.14 billion, so a little over $1 billion in annual healthcare cost reduction just from having access to recreational space. And that's not a small amount of money to not spend on healthcare. So I think the public health benefits, the reductions in asthma because of trees, a lot of our parks like Crotona Park and Forest Hill Park are doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to carbon capture because they're right next to car infrastructure. A lot of them are right next to highways. And so, again, these are spaces that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in some of the most vulnerable neighborhoods and need that support from the Parks Department to so that people can continue to enjoy these spaces and obtain and continue to gain the health benefits from being in green space and being in parks.
And a lot of money is being devoted in the city to resilience, fighting back storm surge and so on. And was it 30% of the parks, I think, are coastal areas? Some remarkable statistic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they help to deal with that same issue that is at the forefront of everybody's mind.
Yeah, exactly. And so something that people don't think about, at least I don't think about very much, is that the importance of wetlands and how that falls under the jurisdiction of parks as well, and how wetlands are among the first line of defense for us against toxic runoff, against stormwaters, against flooding, and such an opportunity for learning and recreation for kids as well, to be able to go out in these spaces and enjoy and learn about biodiversity and wildlife.
I would invite you all to ask questions as well, and also on the live stream, you can type questions into the Q&A and they'll be fed to us. Yes, sir.
So you talk about this sort of lane and maintenance and operations. When did that start? Because under Bloomberg, we had this idea that it was the biggest expansion of parks since the 1930s.
You were asking when did the drop in the cut in the budget happen?
In the operations and maintenance budget. I guess the capital budget is different than the maintenance budget.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the capital budget is.
When you talk about this 1%, are you talking, is that all operations and maintenance, or is that capital budget?
Yes, so the question is whether or not, so you said Bloomberg kind of it's talked about expanding the parks since the 1930s, the biggest expansion since the 1930s, and asking whether or not there is a difference between the capital budget and the expense budget. And yes, there is a difference. The capital, the 1% is specific to the maintenance and operation budget. Yes.
So during Bloomberg, did the operation and maintenance budget, was it dropping then too?
No, it's been at 0.5% since the late 70s.
Yes, ma'am.
Daniel, earlier you spoke about one person per 118 acres. What would be the ideal amount of workers for all the acres of parkland that we have?
She's asking what's the ideal number of gardeners, is what he was talking about, per acre.
That is a good question. I would say 6.
Well, 6 what?
6
You mean-
gardeners per 114
multiply it
acres.
times
yeah,
6.
yeah.
And just to jump into, it's hard for me to conceptualize it from an acre standpoint, but I would say from a council member standpoint for our district, and what I always advocate within the council about why it's important that we fund the parks, equity initiative we have in the council for our districts is, I think of it in terms of, there are these lines of positions we have, 150, city parks workers, about 100 city parks workers, 50 community gardeners. So that's 50 council districts. So you end up with roughly 1 community gardener for every council district, 2 city parks workers for every council district. And that's not nearly enough, right? To take care, can you imagine taking care of parks across the district with 170,000 constituents, and we've got 1 community gardener and 2 city parks workers. So when I visit the parks and playgrounds with the parks workers in my district too, we talk about this all the time. It's just sheerly, it's impossible to have them be able to take care of every single park and playground, even with the few or the one that we have, because it's not enough. And so I think my goal would be that every council member has enough staffing to make sure that every park and playground is attended to on a daily basis, and that's far more than we have now.
Sure.
You know, Riverside Park had goats. This past, yes, you're smiling, you remember. It's been 2 seasons or 2 years now in a row. Why can't the city have their own herd of goats and transport them for every 2 weeks to different gardens?
Yeah, Daniel, why
Yeah,
can't they?
why can't the city have more goats? That is a great question.
We'll add that to the budget discussions.
Yeah, I think we can add goats as a line item, possibly. Yeah, why can't the city have goats come in? Probably because
You have to have the goat maintenance
A goat
crew. You have to
license.
have people.
Yeah,
you have to have
yeah.
people who are able to take care of the goats. Who's going to
Right.
transport the goats around? That's a whole other. The zoo. Okay. Yes. in the back.
Hi, thank you for this talk. How many acres of park is ideal per, like for population? Like we're talking about gardeners per parks, but how much park land should there be in New York for our population size? And that might be aspirational. I know that means hiring many more park maintenance workers, but
yeah,
just out of curiosity.
It would mean additional maintenance workers. It would mean additional capital funds to build more parks. But ideally, if we were going to look at community districts and say, you know, we want everyone to be, and this was part of Bloomberg's push as well, for everyone to be within 5 to 10 minutes of a walking distance of a park. I mean, ideally, we would like the entire city to be within 5 to 10 minutes. Not everyone is right now, but how many parks, let's say, per district? I would say anywhere between like 10 and 15 parks. There are a lot of small parks throughout the community districts and the council districts, but those parks don't get enough attention as it is. And so 1% would allow us to focus on maintaining what we have. Again, 1% would get us to a state of good repair. There's $600 million in deferred maintenance right now. And so building more parks is a part of our 5-point plan for equity, but the 2 other things that we would need to do before that is reform the capital process and allocate 1% of the operating budget to the Parks Department.
And I would just add, it's a great question. And again, it's hard for me to think about it in the data perspective, but from a community standpoint, right? I think what Daniel mentioned, I know Trust for Public Land has done great work around this too, to measure the walkability to parks in our districts, right? And so it's that 10-minute where every New Yorker is a 5 or 10-minute walk from a park. And I would argue we've got to get that lower too, right? I think you want to be able to walk out your door and have green space just a block away or a short walk away. The importance of which really was evident during the pandemic. For many, especially of us, for all of us, we needed it. Those of us with parents with young children, I had a 4-year-old at that point and a 1-year-old in the pandemic. And so you can imagine, how desperate it was for both my wife and I as full-time working, people then too, to get our kids out of the house because they were creating so much chaos inside the house. And at that age, but the parks and playgrounds were the only places that we could all go. And someone reminded me recently at the height of the pandemic, we didn't fully understand yet how COVID worked. All the playgrounds were closed for a period of time. And so, it just makes you realize how important these spaces are. So I would say to that, to be able to just step outside your front door and have a park or playground there is the world we need to get to, the city we need to get to. And we still have much more work to do to get to that point.
The stats that you shared about healthcare, were they centered around your healthcare related to your exercise, or is there a breakdown related to mental health versus your actual physical?
So the stat is specific to healthcare overall, and there are, of course, mental health benefits of being in green space as well. What I cited earlier was 2 hours per week in green space being linked to better health outcomes, and that includes mental health, and of course, like your physical health as well. So yes. Thank you.
I can project. What does the advocacy campaign after tonight look like? How can we help?
Yeah, thank you. So some of you might have a QR code at your table to scan. Please sign the 1% for Parks petition. We also, as Paul mentioned, have a budget rally on March 22nd in City Hall Park at 9 a.m. And we are continuing to advocate for 1% alongside Shekar here. And we need our other council members and other elected officials to stand up and demand this 1%. Yeah, we are, we're continuing to advocate, and like I mentioned, the rally and signing the petition. But there will be more opportunities to come as well. Check out our website, ny4p.org.
And Shekar, how do you translate that, petitions and rallies into action?
Absolutely. Well, I think a couple different ways that Daniel hit on. So our Parks rally and budget hearing is on March 22nd. And so I think coming out before for the rally, signing up to testify at our hearing is going to be really important. That's where, the Parks Department, Parks Commission will be going through all these budget questions. And so hearing the level of public support for this is crucial, right? Because I think at the end of the day, what's most impactful in driving our policy is to show how on a grassroots, on a community level, and citywide level, how much support there is. And so I think those things are important. I think communicating with your local elected officials about the importance of your parks and support for 1% are crucial, because that enables us as council members to go into City Hall in our negotiations to say, look, all of us are united. And it's really how we were able to push with the gains that we got last year too, was that every council member highlighted parks as one of their top issues to push on, both on a citywide level, but also for investments in their parks in their own district too. And so once we have that public support, it both creates momentum to put pressure for our city to invest in these things. It also empowers individuals like myself as the Parks Chair to go into discussions and hearings and advocacy meetings to say this is a vital issue and look at all the evidence we have here to support that. So all of these things really help to drive policy forward, and I think it's crucial to get involved in that way.
Do we have questions from the live stream? We're okay there, okay. Yes, ma'am?
Hi, this is a two-hander, and you can take whichever part you think is more interesting. First, sort of more tactical. I know that parks like Hudson River Park Trust or organizations like Hudson River Park Trust, like Central Park Conservancy, have these very robust volunteer, corporate volunteer infrastructure programs. I know that New York City has NYC Service. There are ways to plug in, but do you feel like these parks that aren't as well funded or don't have this kind of supplemental funding could leverage volunteers more, or is that too much of a stopgap? And my other part that's maybe more controversial is, do you think that these kind of, sexier, more visible Central Park, Riverside Park, having conservancies and Friends of the Park, does that create a have and have not with the the neighborhood park that only got grass last year?
So the reality is that most parks don't have the ability to raise private funds. So it's not necessarily feasible for every park to just pick up a conservancy and pick up volunteers, because they might reach out to volunteers. There might be one person in a community that reaches out for volunteers and they may get no response. So that's the importance of allocating that 1%, because in the places where not everyone has a Central Park Conservancy, a Hudson River Park Alliance or Conservancy, or a Friends of group or a volunteer group, those parks are, again, they're stuck with the Parks Department that is moving from place to place as fast as they can, and are not necessarily, the Parks Department works very hard, but again, they're not seeing on a daily basis the issues that arise, and not everyone can have a volunteer or friends group. And Shekar, you might have something to add just from your community, your volunteers and friends group that exists there.
Absolutely. I think on both points, there's certainly a need for more support for the volunteer groups. I hear it all over the city, in every neighborhood and every park I visit to. I know it in my own district, and we haven't covered this, but I want to just add in too, when we think about creatively how to expand park space, we can look at street space too. We have the biggest open street in Jackson Heights, 34th Avenue open street, which we're trying to convert to a linear park. But I think of it because we have volunteers who run it every single day. And it's very burdensome for them too. So I think we need to recognize that. I think the second part of your question, there is a role for every group and institution to play in supporting an incredible park system that we have and need the funding to support behind it, right? In a world of finite resources, where you've seen the decline in public investment in our parks, the conservancies have played a critical role in also alleviating the burden of where those resources are directed to that the Parks Department has that are finite, right? And so we can make the argument more effectively to invest in neighborhoods that can't afford the conservancies or don't have the resources for them because those resources aren't being claimed by others that do have those resources. So to me, it's the have and have not thing only comes up if there isn't that recognition of we all work together to help each other. And I think, there are conservancies that have done a phenomenal job. I see Betsy here from the Central Park Conservancy that recognize that, they also have a role to play in supporting neighborhoods and communities that don't have those resources too. And so I think as long as we recognize the importance of all working together to invest and support the communities, and I know, for example, Central Park Conservancy has come out to Jackson Heights to see our open street there too and be supportive. And so, things like this really, that's how the system works together. And I think we have to be, honest about that and how we all can play a role in addressing that. And that really is what helps to avoid the situation of a have or have-nots, in an effective way.
So it has become a public-private system, and as the public component has receded, private has tried to make up the difference, but talk for a minute about that.
Well, I would argue that
we have to go back to more robust public funding.
and that's exactly the point, is that the growth of conservancies and private funding should not be an excuse for our Parks Department or our city government to invest less, right? I think if anything, it enables and frees up the Parks Department to do more from a public investment standpoint.
But has it historically been the case that if they see there's private money that's happening, so we can lower the budget, they're kind of taking care of that? Has that been a problem?
I think it's deeper than that, and it's not just our parks; it's our public spaces. And I've done work around our plazas too, like Diversity Plaza in my neighborhood. Same issues. I think city government, and again, I go back to the decline over the last 6 decades. I think they don't think enough about the notion of equity. That just because you've got private groups or institutions that can invest in some areas, that doesn't mean other communities that the city government can walk away from them. And I think that oftentimes when we think about public space, whether it's plazas or green space, city government has then said we can step away and deprioritize it. And that's what we need to work against.
Let me go to someone else. Yeah.
So I wanted to partly ask a question, but it's partly in response. The Parks Department has a nonprofit adjunct wing called the City Parks Foundation, and they recruit volunteers in your local park. Is that still happening?
Yes, it is.
So partly for the woman who asked the question in the back, all of you can go to the Parks Department website and find the City Parks Foundation, and they'll be happy to ask you to volunteer. But it still reinforces the need for employees of the Parks Department in the park. What is the point? I mean, you can go all by yourself to your local park and pick up garbage. But to really have meaningful volunteer work, the Parks Department has to have staff to help plan and coordinate those volunteers. It doesn't take away the need for professionally trained Parks Department employees to properly use, engage, and train volunteers.
And we've even heard from some of these volunteer groups that, before they're bringing in volunteers, they're doing some of the prep work of, like, in this particular case, there were so many hypodermic needles in the park where they were fearing for volunteers engaging with them. So members who were of the volunteer group went out and picked those up preemptively before volunteers could even come in. But if we allocated 1%, the Parks Department would be able to do some of that work and help steward the volunteers as well.
I just wanted to add to that point, and I just thought of an analogy which I've seen as a civil rights lawyer for a long time, representing low-income tenants and public housing. It's the same thing in the housing context as in parks, right? Where, over time, there's been a lot more conversation about the role of private developers in building housing, affordable housing, mandatory, MIH, inclusionary housing. Whatever your thoughts may be on all those things, as that happens, that's not an excuse for government to step back from its own investments in housing. It's not an excuse for government to step back from investing in NYCHA. But you've seen over the last decades, the same way we've seen a regression investment in parks, a decreased investment in public housing. And so for a number of reasons, right? And so I think it's the same analogy. It doesn't give government the excuse to walk away from those obligations, be it housing, be it public space. But that is what has happened over decades, and that's what we need to change.
Let me get someone. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the obscene cost of planting a tree, and I think one of the big drivers of sort of the weakening government capacity is its inability to do things really efficiently, and I say that as a former city worker where we weren't super efficient, but I wonder if you could name one concrete thing you do, if you were managing park workers so that they can better use their time on the clock and get that cost down without cutting their wages, which I think most people in this room probably think are probably too low.
So I think one of the most important things, I'm curious your thoughts too, Daniel, but I think making parks workers permanent lines and permanently funded is a vital, vital fight, because so many of them are seasonal workers. They're rotating through. Not only is that not good for a park system, you want to have dedicated staff. I've seen the way in which, and I've spoken to the commissioner about it too, when the parks workers that are permanent and permanent positions and in those parks know them so well. They know their parks, they know the green, they're dedicated, they love those parks. And I see it in my own neighborhood too, whether I'm working or taking my kids to the park, and I see the workers, I know them, I talk to them about the issues. It makes a huge difference. They're proud of the work they're doing in their parks. And when we create a temporary system of seasonal workers, not only is it a detriment to our park system, but it also, most importantly, is a detriment. It does harm to them, because their jobs, and I've seen it and I've heard it in these budget fights, they don't know if they have job security, and that's it's very frightening for them and anxiety producing for them, and it also creates reasons to pay them less too, and when you are using temporary or seasonal work too. And so the best way we take care of our park system, the best way we increase their wages, is to create permanently funded positions, and that's really the work that I think is very crucial as part of our parks work ahead.
Hold on, let me just get to people who, yes.
Kind of in response to the question about the trees, because I volunteer to plant trees, so I'm free labor. But I think the most important thing that I see that the parks people do is like having the children, showing them how to plant the trees, how to do something with the roots. I mean, those are the most important things, is growing the children and for the employees to have that amount of time to spend with people who live and work around the park, so that they can really appreciate them and share it. So that was, I'm also a city worker, and I know that there's lots of times that people aren't as efficient as they should be, but we also have the free labor, but it's more important to have what I'm trying to say is more important to have the knowledge of the parks people being used in the best way possible.
Yeah, for sure. There's actually a quote in the report from Mitchell Silver, who talks a little bit about growing up in Brooklyn and being very connected to the person who would come and clean the playgrounds, and kind of seeing him as a mentor, and having that relationship. And having that relationship is so important for strengthening our communities, and just being able to feel safe in a park, knowing that, hey, you know, there's Jim who is always there, and is, you know, someone we talk to, and, you know, is our mentor to us, and making sure we're staying out of trouble. And yeah, so that's a great point about just having parks workers available on a regular basis so that they are able to make connections with their communities. Is a huge part of the reason 1% is so important.
We haven't talked about parks programs, sports programs, recreation programs. That's a whole other component.
Yeah, so years ago, there were plenty of recreation programs, but recreation centers have kind of become gyms in a lot of cases, and if there's not gym equipment there, it kind of, you know, it's not very well programmed, and there's no one really using it. 1% is an opportunity to staff these recreation centers with folks who will program and provide programming to their communities so that people can use these centers as they're meant to be used, and then also so that they can kind of become or rediscover their purpose as civic centers for communities as well, to voice complaints, and what better place to do that than parks and public space.
One more question? Okay, I'll come back to you.
Hi, this is for Shekar. I'd like to see a law passed, and put this before your city council members, please, that when there's new construction, they are required to plant a few trees along that axis of where they're building. Even if it's in big planters, whatever it is, because I know for a fact that when some of the bus shelters went up, we had trees on Broadway here. They took the trees away and never put them back, even though there was plenty of room for them to do so, because the shelter didn't go where the trees used to be. I'd like to see that passed.
Thank you for mentioning it, and duly noted. I think I couldn't agree with you more that when we think about construction, new development too, that we're incorporating, you know, as much green requirements in green space requirements into it too, because, you know, one thing and again, that's a priority, right? I think one of the things that I've been outspoken on and worked with a lot of, you know, transportation and safe streets group on too, are some of the developments I think have parking requirements to them. When you build, you've got to incorporate parking to it, but why not have park requirements or green space or tree requirements as part of it too, right? That's something that isn't, it seems so, you know, one, that's a crucial part of the climate fight that we face when we think about building, but absolutely. And two, it's just, this is how we think about planning communities, is housing, green space, all working together, and being part of what makes communities healthy and help them thrive. So I really agree with that.
So just to summarize, there's basically three components, right, to what you're looking for.
Yes. Yes.
You wanna
Yeah,
they're right
sure.
here.
Yeah, they're right there. So the first is optimize parks for cleaner parks and stronger communities. The second is preserve and grow the urban tree canopy and wetlands as refuge and protectors of the city, and grow programs to directly serve communities. Those are our three major impacts of allocating 1%.
Shekar, one last thing you want to add about what people can do to move this forward?
Absolutely. I think I would say on the community level and on the citywide level. On the citywide level, it's really joining the incredible coalition from New Yorkers for Parks to so many others, the Play Fair Coalition otherwise that you all know about, that are pushing forward on these issues every day. Those are the voices that so many of us, myself chief among them, turn to figure out what our advocacy positions are and how we push forward with them. So part of that citywide, I think, is very crucial. And then I think in your own communities too, spending time in your parks and green spaces, getting to know your parks workers and making sure their stories are being told, their voices are being uplifted too, I think is so crucial because, like I said before at the beginning, they are the beating heart of our park system. Our budgets need to center and really focus and invest in them. And so the more their stories are out there about how much they care for our parks, the more we really can illustrate how, from a human standpoint, how important our parks are for workers, for our public health, for our lives. And I think, the more we can all do that as New Yorkers, the more we can elevate how important, how vital our parks are for all of us.
Shekar Krishnan, thank you for supporting this issue in the City Council. Daniel Abram, thanks for the report, for your wisdom. Adam Ganzer, thanks for your leadership on this. Where is he? I can't. Oh, there he is, back in the corner. Thank you, New Yorkers for Parks, which has been around for 100 years, right? And thank you all very much for being here. This is great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.